But that also means media that are pushing those fear and anger buttons over and over and over again get more and more and more of our attention. Because we are wired to pay attention to those things, more than we are wired to pay attention to like the beautiful music we hear a couple blocks over. If I don't pay attention to that, I'm not going to die. But if I don't pay attention to a car that's barreling toward me on the road, I will die. So we are wired to pay attention to those things, which makes it really easy for us or any social media to capture our attention with fear and anger. So this is another piece I'm not going to get into today, but this is where I think social media hygiene becomes a really important topic for churches. Like, how do we curate our own media intake so that we aren't being continually diminished in our psychological and spiritual health by what we're experiencing? Because we do live within a realm of algorithmic capitalism, where our attention is making money, and the algorithm is always geared toward getting more of our attention. And fear and anger do that better than anything. That's a really helpful one. Yeah.
So the term trauma comes to mind here as I'm looking at this. I mean, it's kind of a chicken or egg thing here. Do you think trauma cause basically provoke all these things, or are these the fruit of trauma itself? I mean, or does trauma figure into this?
Yeah, that's a good question. I don't think this is necessarily the fruit of trauma. I mean, these are just things that happen in our lives all the time. We're always experiencing things that might cause us fear, anger, or sadness. The place where trauma comes in is, well, a couple places. We typically colloquially use trauma to talk about things that are really hard, life-threatening kinds of experiences. The experience itself, the event itself, is not the trauma, psychologically speaking. It is how our body minds react to that event. So 3 people could be in a life-threatening car accident. 2 of them don't develop any long-term trauma symptoms, and 1 of them does. They all experience the same thing, but one of their body minds reacts to that in a way that it repeats in their neurology over and over again. It's held in the body. The most important thing that shields us from developing long-term trauma responses to a really horrible event is the community that we belong to that holds us in the aftermath of that event. So if we experience over and over again things that push our fear and anger and sadness buttons with no community to hold us in the aftermath of that, no community to talk to openly about that, then that is where trauma symptoms generally arise. And it might not arise to the level of trauma symptoms, but just long-term chronic stress symptoms that do diminish our body's capacity because stress is hard on our bodies. And I talked to you about this last time I was here, I think, about how loneliness can actually operate like trauma on the body. So again, evolutionarily, if we, in our way back evolutionary history, were separated from our community, we were at risk of dying, either because we would be attacked by a wild animal or we wouldn't be able to grow the food that we needed. So being isolated from community was a signal to our body minds that we were in danger. So it raises this here. We don't experience that the same way today. If we were isolated, we could still survive. But our really, really old parts of our brains don't know that. So loneliness still signals to us, you're in danger, you're in danger, you're in danger, you're in danger. Which is why loneliness and isolation, as a Surgeon General said several years ago now, is about as unhealthy for our bodies as smoking 15 cigarettes a day. The reason it's that unhealthy for our bodies is because our bodies are registering loneliness as danger, and it's having a really harmful stress effect on us. So that's where I think community to hold you amid the fierce anger and sadness is a really important part to begin this practice of hope. Because if we can't be held in these apocalyptic emotions, developing these kinds of long-term temperaments and moods and outlooks on life start to move us away from hope and toward something that looks like, loss of meaning, apathy, cynicism, etc. Anything else before we move on? Yeah.
Well, part of that was borne out, wasn't it? Like, in the difference between the way World War II soldiers came back from the trauma of war on ships with other community, with a community of people who experienced the same thing. They had 2 weeks or more to process that.
Yeah.
Versus Vietnamese soldiers who came back 12 hours later when shoved back into society without that process.
Wow, yeah, I didn't know that comparison. That's really interesting. Yeah. And it's also why, soldiers who there's soldiers who return from, the front lines today, which is typically thought of as a really happy thing, really glad that this person is home and not in danger anymore. But there can be a certain kind of grief in that return too, because you are no longer with the community of people who have experienced the things you've experienced and talk about those things with first-person knowledge. So even in the ways we welcome people back with joy and excitement can also be sort of tinged with grief too for that person. Yeah, and certainly guilt and what we're now calling moral injury. The ways that people are forced to do things in wartime that run against their own moral compass. And I suspect that in the coming decades we'll see a whole lot of ICE agents experiencing extreme moral injury for what they've had to do. Not everyone, because for some, it is not against their moral compass to do what they're doing. But for many of them, there will be a sense of moral injury to what they've experienced here and other places.
The novelist Tony Hillerman was a frontline combat grunt in World War II. And he had much of that sort of experience. He came back injured. There was sort of a buffer in there because he got a serious wound that put him in an Army hospital for the rest of the war. But when he eventually did get home, he still found it very hard to enter back into the very familiar people he left behind when he went to war.
Yeah.
He mentioned that most World War II veterans, and I found this true of Vietnam veterans too, they won't talk about it. They won't talk about their experiences, not if they were in combat. Largely because the people they're dealing with don't have those experiences and simply don't understand.
Yeah, and on a much smaller scale, I think there are people who are coming into their communities, even their communities of faith, with things like fear and anger and sadness so present in their life, and the diminishment of any conversation about that in that community makes them think, well, I'm the only one who experiences this and feels this. I can't talk about this with others. So normalizing, regularizing the discussion within community that can care for us of these feelings is a really important starting place for the practice of hope. Then there's another layer that gets added to this, which I think about as transimminent emotions. And the way in which I'm using that term is just to indicate that these emotional experiences move us outward beyond our bounded sense of self, toward other people and toward the wider web of life and toward God. But they also put us in really close proximity to the things that are right in front of us, the people that we are in community with, the ecological web of life, which I think is a really important part of this larger conception of hope in relationship. And the transimminent emotions I want to think through with you are gratitude, grief, and wonder. Gratitude asks us to think about and feel what it is that feels like a gift in our life. Things that open us up toward the wider world or to the people around us, that move us toward giving. And as an emotion, I think gratitude is one. And I do want to be sure you hear this. These emotions, these complex transimminant emotions are not the opposite or the antidote to fear, sadness, and anger. So you're caring for the fear, sadness, and anger ring. You're cultivating the transimminant emotion ring. You're doing things in community that intentionally move us toward the expression and experience of gratitude. Think about all the hymns that you sing here every Sunday morning, and how many of them express gratitude in some way, or seeing the beauty of the world in some way. Grief, I think about this a little differently than sadness. Sadness alerts us to the things that we feel like we are losing in our life in the world, but grief puts us together with other people to hold those losses together. Grief asks us to do something with other people, to ritualize the losses that we feel. This is why I think it's so important and poignant and beautiful and horrible, the ways that, the killing of Renee Good and Alex Preddy, and I'm sure many of you have gone to those sites since then and seen the memorials that grow up at those sites. I mean, this is the movement from sadness into grief, a communally oriented way of holding sadness and loss together. And churches are good at this. We have a lot of ritual and tools to express and to hold grief together. And finally, wonder. Wonder is an emotion that moves us, as more than probably any other, out of our bounded sense of self toward others, or toward the larger web of life, and toward the divine, with a sense of awe, a sense of curiosity, a sense of deep interest in the world. So pay attention to the things in your life that are moving you toward that kind of sense of awe, or wonder, or curiosity. Most Western psychologists don't consider wonder a primary emotion, but in other sort of psychological systems of the world, this is considered a primary emotion. There's a 3rd century Sanskrit text that talks about the importance of wonder as a primary human emotion, and it describes wonder as seeing divinely. You think about Abraham Joshua Heschel, if you've read Heschel. Heschel talks about wonder with the term radical amazement. I think the probably biggest detriment of a lot of churches is that we don't recognize the special role we have in curating wonder in people's lives. And in worship, you do this as well as anyone, I think. I mean, I come to worship here and am always moved toward awe in what I experience in worship. But outside of worship, you need to also think about the ways that you're curating and cultivating wonder in your life. Wonder within the larger web of life. Wonder at the relationships that you share with community. I think one of the really profound things that came out of the last 2 months here in the Twin Cities and in Minnesota generally is the way that people saw the beauty and strength and resilience and care of the kinds of communities that exist here in Minnesota, which didn't just happen last week, These have been cultivated for a really long time. And there's a certain sense of awe and wonder in that, and seeing a community come together to hold one another in a really intense and traumatic and violent time. All right, before I move on to the rest of it is a 6-part kind of framework for the practice of hope that we'll maybe do 1 or 2 parts today and the rest next week, because there's a lot of story that goes into illustrating these next 6 parts. So before I get into that, let me pause again and see if there are questions or curiosities that you'd like to raise.
I saw it on the sheet, but can you just explain what transimminent means?
Yeah. Transcendent and immanent. So it moves us outward from our bounded sense of self toward others and toward God, toward something that is transcendent from us. But it also moves us in an immanent fashion, like really close to us, toward others that are in our immediate sphere. So moving us in a transcendent direction and also in an immanent direction at the same time. Sorry.
I think one thing that I'll watch for is, but I'm curious, what do you have to say about this in relation to human development? I look at fear, sadness, and anger and think, as an adolescent, that has a quality that it doesn't for me now. And how does human development figure, how we experience these things. And I guess also related to that, how schools would be places where you cultivate hope.
Yeah, that's a really interesting question. Well, yeah, I mean, I'd be curious to see how you answer that second question after you see the 6 parts, because I think these are practices that move us toward hope that are really good for any community. I developed them particularly for faith communities. And though I'm not really highlighting a lot of it, I think you can see the way that our faith tradition, our sacred texts of Scripture, our liturgical traditions sort of encompass a lot of this, particularly the cultivation of gratitude and grief and wonder. The developmental piece, yeah, I haven't thought about that in terms of the move from adolescence to adulthood. That's a really interesting question. I'll give that some thought. Anything else before we move on? All right. So, at this first ring around hope here, that's the place for care. Care for the feelings of emotion, of fear, sadness, and anger that are rising in our lives and our communities. The second ring is for the task of cultivating these complex emotions. Gratitude, grief, and wonder don't often just happen. We cultivate those emotional experiences in our life, in community. This final ring is what I think of as invoking the task of curation. We actually need to do something in order to make these 6 pieces happen. And you can see what they all are on your handout, but we're probably only going to get to maybe 1 or 2 today. We'll get to the rest next time. So the first of the 6 parts of the hope wheel is realistic appraisal. And I want to say, first of all, for the most part, these 6 pieces are not linear. You don't need to start one place and move around. You can really start wherever your resources are already strongest and move from there. But I do think there is some sense in which realistic appraisal is a pretty foundational one. So if I had to sort of boil it down into a few words, I'd say developing a realistic appraisal means keeping your eyes open, looking at the world as it is and not as it once was or as you wish it to be. You're going to get to the wish it to be part later, but right now the realistic appraisal is about putting the pieces together to understand the world as it is, or the situation as it is, the thing that you're facing right now together. Refusing to look away or to escape with wishful thinking or fatalism. And remember, fatalism can either be optimistic fatalism, it'll all work out, don't worry, or pessimistic fatalism, we're all doomed, there's nothing you can do about it. A realistic appraisal cuts through both of those forms of fatalism, just to see with clarity what is happening. And I think that there are a few things that often hinder us from developing this realistic appraisal within Christian communities. I've been interviewing pastors the last year or so about their vision of the future and how they are thinking about the near future in their life in the world. And I've noticed one thing that often hinders us is fear among pastors. And then here's the words of one pastor I interviewed. She said, "I never used to worry about standing up in front and preaching. I've been doing it since I was 16 or 17 years old, and it never used to scare me. And the last 10 years or so, it makes me nervous to do it, to get up there, to be vulnerable and open with what I think and my beliefs on all this stuff, and not worry about losing every person in my congregation or worse." Pastors are concerned about congregants' reactions to hearing the realities of the world spoken in the pulpit. And I think a lot of congregants are concerned about the polarization of their friend groups and don't bring up certain things with certain people so that they don't sort of step into some of those polarizing things. Secondly, I think our fear of discouraging other people into despair with a realistic appraisal of particularly dire situations sometimes keeps us from really developing the realistic appraisal. But again, hope allows room for despair, for hopelessness. And one of the things that I've noticed is that when people don't have a place to develop a realistic appraisal of their life in the world at the moment, that actually does increase the feeling of sadness or anger or fear into those long, elongated moods or temperaments. And when you have a place to develop this realistic appraisal, it can actually help emotionally. There's been some really interesting study by some futurists who have noted that when you do future kind of scenario building around any particular kind of scenario, economic collapse, climate collapse, etc., sort of playing out that future scenario, no matter how dire it is, within a community that can think through that future together, actually increases people's ability to cope with that future. Not doing that pushes us further into isolation, into those elongated moods. And a third factor that keeps us from a realistic appraisal, I think, is the all-out assault that we're experiencing on information right now. The ways that misinformation, intentional disinformation, AI hallucinations and made-up information, deep fakes, the ways we live in particular information silos keeps us from developing a really robust conception of what's happening in our life in the world. All right, I want to just illustrate what a realistic appraisal can look like with a story. And this story is about the people of Denmark during World War II. At some point, they discovered that the Nazis planned to deport the entire Jewish population of Denmark. When the Nazis revealed that plan, the leaders of the Danish church sent an open letter to German officials that was read from every pulpit in the nation on October 3rd, 1943. And in part, it read, "Wherever Jews are persecuted because of their religion or race, it is the duty of the Christian church to protest against such persecution, because it is in conflict with the sense of justice inherent in the Danish people and inseparable from our Danish Christian culture through the centuries." And the letter goes on. Read from every pulpit in the nation on one Sunday. Then they collaborated with one another to hide their Jewish neighbors until they could evacuate them to nearby Sweden. And this effort was organized by hundreds of private citizens working together. They collected funds for the effort. On the night that they had planned to rescue their Jewish neighbors to get them on boats to Sweden, every Nazi ship in the area was docked for repairs. Because the Danes bribed the just foot soldier Nazis to dock the ships. That was part of what they were collecting money for. So that all the Nazi ships were docked for repairs. Then they got all the fishermen in the area to provide their boats to get the Jews out to Sweden. But the fishermen were pretty poor. I mean, they worked day to day, for their living. So another part of what they raised money for was to pay the fishermen a day's wage to use their boats to take the Jews to Sweden. In the end, the Nazis were only able to deport 580 of Denmark's 7,000 Jews. Now, here's why I think this is a good illustration of realistic appraisal. They didn't wait so long that it got so bad that they couldn't do anything about it. They saw what was happening. They knew what was coming. And they made plans from that realistic appraisal to do something about it. And they saved their neighbors' lives and provided for their neighbors who were losing a day's wage to help in the process. And bound up in that story is a community that was acting out of a realistic appraisal of a very dire situation in order to save their neighbors. Let me stop before going on to the next one. I think we can get one more in, but let me leave a little room for questions around realistic appraisal. Anything you want to say or ask?
I just have a question about your chart. It's not linear from inside out. You've got the blue one slightly off. Are wonder, gratitude, and grief coming out of fear to gratitude, anger to wonder, sadness to grief, or is that just another set and they're not necessarily linear to each
Yeah,
other?
they're not linear to each other.
Okay.
Yeah.
And the same thing with the green.
Right, yeah,
It isn't like we go from anger to wonder to realistic appraisal, it can be at any point.
right,
Okay.
yeah.
That's helpful just to
It's all
understand.
non-linear, more cyclical. And I think eventually, when you sort of build it all out, where it becomes really, really rich and strong is where you can make connections across to different parts of this outer circle, but you're always also crossing the inner circles. I don't think we can make a realistic appraisal of what's going on in our life in the world without trying to also be cultivating gratitude and wonder and grief.
Yeah.
Because seeing what's happening is going to provoke our grief and our need to hold the losses, but we also need to be able to practice joy together, and gratitude together, in order to have the emotional elasticity we need to even look with eyes wide open at what's happening in the world around us.
One way to help visualize that, I think you just see those as concentric rings that are free to turn within each other. So
Yes.
you can reorient it any way you want at that moment.
Yeah. Thank you. It's very helpful feedback because I'm just developing this little framework here for some further work.
It's interesting that critical thinking has become vilified by, certain segments of our culture, and it would seem to me that critical thinking would be very much a part of realistic appraisal. In order to be able to look at something objectively and not swayed by some kind of subjective belief or whatever.
Yeah, critical thinking and a whole bunch of other things are under attack, like journalism. It's really hard to develop a realistic appraisal of what's going on in our life in the world without really good reporting on what that is. So when we see journalists under attack, it is diminishing our capacity to see what's happening in our life in the world, diminishing our ability to develop a realistic appraisal. Yeah, it's a really helpful point. And the attack on education and critical race theory, which is actually just the history of race in the country. Like, if we can diminish people's ability to think about things, we take away their ability to act out of that. Right, yeah.
I was gonna ask just, you were mentioning how hard it is to, I was just gonna kind of throw it back to you, like, how do you feel like I'm finding out the accurate picture of what's happening in the world right now? Like, what steps do you go through? What do you read? What do you not read? What do you kind of filter out?
Yeah, that's a good question. I imagine a lot of you have some strategies for that in the room. I have particular news outlets that I trust and that I go to, but also I try really hard to seek out more long form kinds of journalism that can go a little deeper than the short articles, and certainly a little deeper than the attention grabbing kinds of social media posts and things like that. But for me, it's also really important to develop that kind of realistic appraisal through kind of academic theory that helps me understand what I'm seeing, or gives me a framework for understanding what I'm seeing in life in the world too. Yeah. And talking with other people about this, because other people are taking in different things than you're taking in, so developing a robust picture with that kind of comparison.
Yeah, that's kind of what I was going to say. A realistic appraisal means not just looking at your silo of sources.
Yeah,
It's
right.
looking at what are other people hearing and what are other people seeing.
Yeah.
And right now you have to be prepared to switch resources really suddenly at times. For instance, for most of my life, CBS was one of the most reliable resources in the world.
Yeah.
Now I wouldn't trust them. And it's happened in a matter of months.
Yeah.
And I just noticed that some of the reliable sources that I had, AI has suddenly stepped in, and what you thought was your source,
Yep.
you look at that and you go, wait a minute, something's
Yep.
not right here.
Yeah.
And you've got to stop for a minute and say, is this really who I'm listening to, or is this something made up?
Right, yeah. And AI is going to completely change our style of being human in the next decades. It's already shifting our style of being human, and one of them is how we take in and understand information that we're seeing.
I would particularly emphasize being careful about YouTube.
Yes.
If you go to the YouTube site to listen to Malala services, you will see lots of ads for news reports that are totally fakes,
Yeah, yeah.
totally untrue.
Yeah. So this is another topic that before we can go into social media, hybrid, the way we take in media. I want to do one more of the pieces of the wheel, and we'll get to the others next week. This is the courage to risk, to not look away, to move toward the pain and broken places in the world, within community. All of this is meant to be within community. So I'm going to tell you a story that I think illustrates this really well. And it's a story that begins in 1986, when a friend of mine, Jim Matulski, became the pastor of the Metropolitan Community Church in San Francisco. And the MCC Church in Castro in San Francisco, almost entirely LGBTQ church. And throughout those years, the church became the de facto LGBTQ community center, open always for services, community meetings, weddings, funerals. Jim described it this way, I really love this. He said it was a protest every Friday night, which turned into a dance party. And I think we can learn a lot from our queer ancestors in faith who were able to hold together protest and joy in a sort of simultaneity, because you need to be able to practice joy in order to be able to do the hard work of striving for justice. The church was growing and dying all at the same time. They added a second and third service each Sunday, and they also held 3, 4, 5 funerals a week of men who were dying of AIDS. About half of the 60,000 gay men in the city had AIDS at that time, in the early to mid-'80s. Jim said they were dying and in great pain, and in some instances barely able to talk. And everybody basically thought that they had brought this on themselves. Many worried that they were going to hell. And for many men in the community, they were untouchable by other people. Doctors and nurses didn't want to touch them. Their family members had rejected them. Funeral directors didn't want to handle the bodies of men who had died of AIDS. So the MCC Church did something at that point I think is really an important story of liturgical innovation to meet the particular experiences of life in the world at that point. That was when people came up for communion, they received the elements from one person at the front. And then they went to the next person, and that person would lay their hands on their shoulders and look them in the eye, say their name, and speak a blessing over them. At the time that they were untouchable everywhere else, they were touched at the table of grace in their church. Jim says it was an act of revolution as well as resistance, because everyone at the communion table, both ministers and parishioners, were excluded from the sacrament in most other churches. Jim said we were seizing communion back from our oppressors. This is where the piece around courage takes off here. By the early mid-'90s, some treatment had developed, but it required 36 pills a day, and it made men really, really, really sick. The lesbians in the community were the heroes of this movement because they were caring for the men who were dying of AIDS, giving them care and dignity in their last days. But the one thing that would help amid the nausea that was induced by this medicine was marijuana. It would suppress the nausea a bit, increase the appetite a bit, and the city just looked the other way. They didn't prosecute marijuana possession in San Francisco, so buyers clubs emerged for people to be able to access marijuana. There was a man who was the Attorney General of California who wanted to become the governor, and he started to crack down on the marijuana sales overnight, to shut down all the buyers clubs, started to prosecute men, seizing their assets. And Jim was torn. He didn't know what the church should do about this. And he had just been diagnosed with HIV himself. And he said there was a shift in him at that point where you realized you're only here as long as you're here. So what are you so afraid of? And it was a time of his own sort of summoning of courage. And he was a little conflicted about whether the church should be giving out marijuana to men, because they knew that was what helped them. And he contacted a woman named Phyllis Nelson in the church, whose son and partner had both already died of AIDS. And Phyllis said, of course we'll pass out marijuana, and I'll stand right next to you while we do it. And again, it was an act of liturgical innovation, because they passed out little baggies of marijuana after communion, and and before the last hymn. And Jim said they had rules. You had to have a doctor's note, no money could be exchanged, the pot had to be donated. But the men would come up. Let's see, I think I have a picture of this. No, I don't. I didn't put this picture in. Sorry about that. The men would come up and receive their little baggie of marijuana before they went home on Sunday morning. I want to read you what Jim said about this act, because it's so beautiful. He said, "I took a risk, I used my body, I acted on a belief that was motivated by my desire to provide healing and comfort for my friends, and I didn't know what else that I could do, but this was something I could do, and I did it. And the risk was real, and the spiritual intensity was real, and the tangible relief for the people who used it was real." Jim said, "Let your acts of love guide you, even if it means great risk. The greater love, the greater the risk, and you will never regret acts of great love." If you want to know more about that story, there's a historian named Lynn Gerber, who, there was a man in this MCC church who discovered a couple of years ago that he had all these tapes, cassette tapes, of every service for about 10 years through the AIDS epidemic, the earliest decade of the AIDS epidemic. And he gave them to Lynn, and she has gone through all of them. And she's created an 8-episode podcast called When We All Get to Heaven, which is beautiful. It tells the story of the church in this era, and you get to hear clips of sermons from Jim and other preachers. You get to hear this congregation singing together. One of the best podcasts I've ever listened to. And this is the kind of story we need right now in our churches. Stories of communities that were pushed to the brink and practiced courage and risk together. So I would really encourage you to save this and listen to it later. Okay, we're going to save the other 4 pieces of the wheel for next week, but in the last 5 minutes we have, are there questions that you might want to talk through before we close? Yeah.
Well, it's not a question. I just want to share, to go back to trauma. One of the saints from our congregation, Elma Apple, I'm sorry that some of you didn't get to know her, but when she was in her 90s, and her sons kept the drugstore on, I think, 47th and Lindale open, just so she'd have something to do. So she was working there, and then one day, a guy came in and stuck a gun in her face. And he leaped over, he knocked her down, punched her, knocked her down, and went behind it to get some drugs. And her husband, who had died 10 years earlier, told her that if anything like that happened, take off your rings, your engagement and my wedding ring. So she did that, and she hit him under the counter. The guy spied her rings on his way back and grabbed the rings and then took off. And she was in her 90s. I thought I was going to kill her. But what she did was to tell she got up in front of the education class, told the story. She told it to anybody that would listen to her. She kept telling that story over and over and over again. And she worked through the trauma. She became whole and then died several years later when she broke her hip. And I wanted to take her to the family counseling unit where I was working to tell her story, because she understood what we tried to. She talked it through and took away the power of the trauma.
Yeah, that gets back to the effect that community has to hold you in the aftermath of trauma, to have people who will listen to that story. That's beautiful. Good morning, friends. Good morning. Good to be back with you this morning. This is the second forum of a 2-part forum. I know some of you weren't here last week, so I'll briefly catch you up. And I was counting this morning back on my time here at Mount Olive, and this is my ninth forum here in the last 2.5 years. I moved here 2.5 years ago to join the faculty of Luther Seminary, where I teach congregational community care leadership. So thanks for being such a hospitable congregation to me in my time here. Always glad to be here. This is a framework for thinking about how to practice hope. I'll catch those of you up who weren't here last week and refresh your memory if you were. This is a type of hope that I conceive of as not an inner possession, something that we have, but something that we practice in community. A hope that does not find its opposite in despair, but actually germinates in the soil of despair. Hope, in my conception of it at least, really begins in a place of despair or hopelessness. So if you're feeling despair this morning, I want you to hear that you are not in a place of unhopefulness or anti-hopefulness. That is actually the place where hope begins. A hope whose antithesis is certainty, not despair. If you're certain about the future, then you aren't in a place of hopefulness. And certainty can take two forms. One is the fatalism of sort of pessimism, like everything is doomed, there's no use in trying. But there's also the certainty of a sort of fatalistic optimism, like everything will work out in the end, don't worry too much about it. Neither of those two lend themselves to hope. And this is a type of hope that I'm considering one that's undomesticated, or in the process of being undomesticated from its captivity to things like wishful thinking, which is all over our kind of American Christian spirituality, or narratives of progress, which are the narratives we tend to live by in U.S. culture. Things are always getting better. That narrative of progress is not hope. And progress is fine, and there is progress in many areas of our lives, but progress is not a linear development. And this is a hope that's undomesticated from the captivity to optimism as well. So if you don't feel optimistic, that's okay. You can still practice hope. So this is what I am thinking about as a type of feral hope that is rewilded for a life amid the dangers and uncertainties of wilderness places. And last week we talked about the two inner rings, and we started on this outer ring. This inner ring here, or what I was talking about last week, is the apocalyptic emotions. The things that arise in us when things in our life feel like they're coming to an end. Things are getting really dire. Fear, which has a really important signal to us that something that we care about is threatened. Anger, this sort of notion that arises in us when we see things that we know should not be happening, that are imperiling people and communities that we care about. Sadness over the things that we are losing. And these apocalyptic emotions are also not the opposite of hope, not things that we should fight against. They're signals to us. They tell us something about our life in the world. And that inner ring needs our care in community. Places where we can hold people's experience of fear and anger and sadness, listen to those messages, care for people in those places, so that these really important emotions don't elongate into temperaments or moods like anger elongating into vengefulness, or sadness elongating into withdrawal and numbness, or fear elongating into something like apathy and not just feeling immobilized. Then the second ring around that is what I was describing last week as the transimminent emotions. They move us together in an imminent way toward others in our community, but they also move us outward from our bounded sense of self toward the divine. Practices of gratitude, practices of wonder or awe, practices of grief that hold the sadness of our life in the world and all that we're losing. Then this outer ring, which we started, is sort of the mobilizing. So the inner ring, you care for these emotions. This second ring, you cultivate these more complex emotional experiences. And this outer ring is what we curate because they mobilize us in hopeful action in the world. And we talked about the first two spokes here, a realistic appraisal, having a really clear sense of what is happening in the world right now, looking with open eyes at what is going on, not living in denial, not burying our heads in the sand, not wishful thinking our way out of what's happening, but looking with eyes wide open, taking in the information we need to make sense of our life in the world. The second ring, the courage to risk, is about moving toward those places of danger and practicing risk together and learning courage together. I don't know that any of us are as courageous as we want to be on our own. But when we are in community, we can build that capacity for courage and for risk, genuine risk of our comfort, even of our lives. And the stories we illustrated those with last week, the realistic appraisal was the Danish church that came together during the rise of the Nazi movement to save their Jewish neighbors. Remember, the plan was to deport all of the Jews in Denmark. The Danish church banded together and saved all but 580 of their 7,000 Jewish neighbors because they did not wait too long. They had a realistic appraisal of what was about to happen, and they moved. The courage to risk was illustrated by the story of the Metropolitan Community Church in San Francisco during the AIDS epidemic, early years of the AIDS epidemic, when they were coming together to hold the lives of those who were dying in their midst, and even coming together to provide marijuana for men who were dying of AIDS, when that was the only thing that would help them in those final days of their lives, when the Attorney General was starting to crack down on marijuana possession in the cities and stripping and even taking the assets of gay men. Realistic appraisal, courage to risk, and now moving to the next piece of the circle here, what I think of as an anticipatory view. And there's no linear progression to these spokes. You can start anywhere you want, but there are a lot of ways that these spokes connect up to one another in some important ways. For example, you can have a realistic appraisal and stay there, and I think a lot of mainline progressive churches tend to do this. Diagnose the problem over and over and over again until we are just so heavy laden with the despair of what is happening that we are immobilized in it. The anticipatory view really needs to connect up with that realistic appraisal, because the realistic appraisal says, this is what's happening in our world right now. And the anticipatory view says, this is what could be happening. This is the future that we are moving toward. And it is an uncertain future, one that we don't know that we will reach, but with, for example, the courage to risk, we're moving in the direction of this anticipatory view. I want to illustrate this with a story too. Some of you may know this story. It's the story of the very beginnings of what became the Metropolitan Community Church. This is Troy Perry. Perry was a Pentecostal minister with an anguished history of trying to reconcile his sexuality as a gay man with his faith. And for a long time, he thought that divorcing his sexuality and faith was the only way to do that. But eventually, Perry came to sense his call to hold his sexuality and faith together and try to make a way for LGBTQ people to practice faith openly in their lives. And what Troy did was put an ad in the Advocate magazine. Anybody still read the Advocate magazine? I haven't seen it in a while, but it's probably the most famous gay magazine in the country. And at the time, really big. He put an ad in the Advocate magazine and said, anyone who wants to come to a Bible study in my house in LA, meet on October 6th, 1968, at whatever time, and we'll have a Bible study together. It's for queer people to come together and have a Bible study. 12 people showed up at that Bible study. Perry thought, now this is a really, really nice picture of what it means to develop an anticipatory view. Perry thought this movement to create a space for queer people to practice their faith was going to be an interim kind of stopgap measure for, he thought, maybe 2 years. Because at the, by 2 years, all of the mainline denominations would have come around to embrace LGBTQ people. So sometimes your anticipatory view is really big, Now, obviously that didn't happen by 1970. But what did happen was that little Bible study in his living room with 12 people grew into the largest grassroots movement in LGBTQ history, the Metropolitan Community Church. I think it is incredible that the largest grassroots movement in LGBTQ history was not, an advocacy organization, a community building organization, et cetera, et cetera. It was a church. That's not typically the way we tell queer history in the United States, but this is the history of our movement. It happened with this Bible study, and if you know your kind of modern gay history, 1968 is the year before Stonewall, which is where we often begin our modern telling of LGBT history. But before Stonewall, there was a church, and it started with an anticipatory view of what could be possible if we got together and practiced our faith together as queer people. And it grew into the largest grassroots movement in LGBTQ history. And then the first building ever owned by LGBTQ people was the first sanctuary of the MCC Church in LA that they bought in 1970, which also became the home to the first queer synagogue in the world, I believe, that was housed also in this building. I think that is a beautiful picture of what it means to develop an anticipatory view. Because remember, 1968, Troy Perry had no model for this. Troy Perry had no sense of what it meant to be an openly queer pastor. That wasn't happening at that point. He had a sense of call and a vision for what might be possible if he put this ad in the magazine and invited people to his living room. And this is what happened from that. So I love this story as an illustration of what it means to develop that kind of anticipatory view. I'm going to do one more spoke and then we'll stop for some questions. This spoke in the wheel is about the necessity of community and the practice of hope. I don't think, we can all sort of have our own practices of hope in a lot of different ways, but I'm not sure that we can really practice hope in its full Christian biblical sense unless we are practicing it together. Jesus didn't call solo disciples. He invited people into community with one another. Many years ago, one of the denominations I relate to, called the Cooperative Baptist Fellowship, this was back when I was in seminary, it was probably 20 years ago. I went to the General Assembly, and there was a South African Methodist minister there named Trevor Hudson, and I don't remember anything else about this conference except for this one line from this one minister that has haunted me ever since for 2 decades. He said, disorganized good is no match for organized evil. Disorganized good is no match for organized evil. And we can see the organization of evil in our lives in the world right now. And we can see in our own community what it looks like to organize good. And it comes through community. I think one of the reasons that the Twin Cities has become such a beacon of hopeful action for the rest of the country in the midst of the ice siege on our international immigrant neighbors is that we have a history of a sense of collective efficacy. The sense that we can come together and do something together. Part of this is because the Lutherans were so good at organizing to bring immigrants here in the first place. I don't think that's something people outside of this place recognize as a part of the history of the organization of good in this place. That there's a history of organizing to do something that we can draw on. We have sort of the muscle memory of community here. That certainly goes back to that, but probably something far beyond that. Certainly goes back to George Floyd and the uprising around Floyd's murder. All of those things have built collective efficacy in this community. And I imagine you, as a congregation, can also think about the times in your life as a community here at Mount Olive when you have done hard things together. When you were moving into a future together that was unknown and uncertain, but you built the capacity as a community to move in that direction, to risk something, to practice courage together, to move toward an anticipatory view of the future that you weren't sure was possible, but you had this sense of call to move in that direction. Those stories are really important to keep alive right now. Those are the stories that make us who we are as a community, and they build our sense of collective efficacy, that we can organize good in the face of organized evil. Here's a story to illustrate that. This came from a book that I would recommend to you, 2024 book called Hope for Cynics. And it's by a Stanford psychologist and neuroscientist named Jamil Zaki. I really love this book. And in the book, he tells the story of two identical neighborhoods in Kobe, Japan. One was called Mano, one was called Mikura. They were just 3 miles apart, these two neighborhoods. Both really similar, dense with factories, workshops, houses. Both were aging middle and working class populations. But there were also a few differences between these communities. Mano was full of small family businesses. Mano relied on trade between neighbors. Women were an integral part of the economy of Mano, whereas Mikura was more patriarchal. Mano also had a history of facing challenges together. Earlier in the 1960s, when factories were poisoning the air and 40% of Mano residents were suffering from asthma, and public services like garbage collection had lapsed, the neighborhood of Mano came together to resist, to fight back against the organized abandonment of their neighborhood. They created a local planning committee that pressured the government for resources. They organized for anti-pollution efforts. Parks started to appear all around Mano. Factories relocated. Trash started to be collected again. The quality of their life improved. The neighborhood of Mikura never had that history of collective action and banding together through hardship. And in 1995, when the massive earthquake hit the city of Kobe, fires erupted across the city and surrounding areas that lasted for 2 days. The fires killed over 5,000 people, destroyed more than 100,000 buildings. And this is where the history of these two neighborhoods comes together in a really interesting way. The people of Mikura watched, many in their night clothes, while their homes turned to ash. Mano did not wait for the authorities to come and help. They leapt into action together. They formed pop-up bucket brigades, grabbing hoses from factories, pumping water from the rivers to fight the fires in their neighborhood. About 1 in every 4 homes in Mano was ruined. But almost 3 of every 4 homes in Mikura was burned. Mikura's death rate was 10 times higher than Mano's death rate. And in the aftermath, Mano formed relief organizations. They collected signatures to build temporary housing. They set up a makeshift daycare. And Mikura didn't coordinate after their losses, and they lost out on a lot of public services. Zaki says this about this story. Around the world, connections between people predict whose towns and cities will bounce back from tsunamis, storms, and attacks. Networks of faith, community, and solidarity pivot in times of need, remaining agile and hardy. When communities lose trust, they grow unstable, like a Jenga tower with the bottom block knocked out. And you know that building communities of collective efficacy and hopeful practice doesn't start in the midst of the emergency. It starts with Lutheran Social Services bringing immigrants to resettle in Minnesota. It starts with the memory of what happened after George Floyd's killing and what the community needed to do in the midst of that. And all of those collective narratives are drawn upon to do something in the midst of the present crisis. So this is what I want to make sure you hear. The community piece of this this reel isn't just about what you do in the midst of a crisis. It's what you do in all of the years leading up to any particular crisis that you need to move through together to build the texture of this community. And not just the community here at Mount Olive, but all of your partner relationships in the community around you, other churches, other organizations, etc. I'll give you just a couple of examples that I think are really nice for my own life. This is a guy named Matt Schumann here in the white shirt. There's me in the pink shirt there. Matt Schumann, one day in about 2015, I just moved to Boston. I was getting out of my car after church on Sunday afternoon when I got home, and Matt Schumann was going out for a run. I'd never met him before, but he stopped me as I was getting out of my car and said, hey, do you want to come to my house? I live right here up the hill. Do you want to come to my house tonight, or tomorrow night, or whenever it was, and watch the presidential debate and having people over from the community? I said, sure. I mean, Boston is not Minnesota. It's hard. It's a little harder to kind of meet your neighbors there in some way. I lived in a neighborhood of like 7,000 people. I didn't know anyone except for the people who lived in my building, upstairs and downstairs. So Matt Schumann taking the step to just see me on the sidewalk and say, you want to come over to my house tonight and watch the debate? It was like, that was a really nice invitation to this southerner who had moved to kind of cold New England. And you see here behind, he's got this is his house up here, this is his garage on the street level. This started what became known as Wenham Street Cinema, that was his street, where pretty much every month he would invite people from the neighborhood to come to his garage and watch a movie together, or sometimes he would invite a local politician who was running for our, the city council seat in our area to come and speak to the community. He did this every month from 2015 to the present, but where I want to sort of stop with that is the pandemic. So all the way up from 2015 to 2020, our neighborhood had been getting together just to watch a movie, to hear a politician speak, to watch the presidential debates, et cetera, et cetera. And I know for many people, the pandemic plunged them into a sense of isolation, cut off from their neighbors. And that was physically true for us too in many ways. But at that point, after 5 years or so of getting together in Matt Schumann's garage to watch movies together, I felt like I knew a lot of the people who lived around me, and I was not alone in that period of the pandemic. If this hadn't happened, I don't know that I would have ever really known anyone in my neighborhood except for the people who lived upstairs from me and downstairs from me. It was a simple thing that he did that had really profound impacts on the life of our community. Eventually, he built on top of the garage this big deck where he could have parties out there too. This is a little concert he had with a local group in our neighborhood. But he asked me when he built the deck on top of his garage to come and to bless the deck, and as he opened it to his community. It was really lovely. Something so simple, but has such a profound impact on people's lives. Another example, and I'll invite you to scan this QR code with your phone if you want. This is from House Calls with Dr. Vivek Murthy, the former Surgeon General. He had a really wonderful podcast all throughout his second term as Surgeon General that was about ways of addressing the crisis of loneliness and isolation. This is one episode called The Neighbor's Table that I loved. It was a woman who in her backyard started inviting people over for meals just in her neighborhood. And people came, and more people came, and they came every month. It became such an important part of her community, her neighborhood, that people would start to ask her if they could have their wedding in her backyard, because that was the place where they experienced community. This is a lovely episode. I think every church should go back to the archives of House Calls and just listen to those episodes, because almost every one of them has some lesson that a church community can pick up and operationalize in their life. And they're all very, kind of simple stories of normal people doing really meaningful things in their life in the world. Let me stop here before we move on to the next two spokes and see if you have any questions or comments that you'd like to make before we proceed. Yeah.
Minneapolis has neighborhood night out.
Yeah.
And that really brought our community is something that has been held out for and brought more people in for lots of fun. The other thing that happened in our backyard is that during COVID, I invited my immediate neighbors and said, "Well, bring your own, bring your own, bring your own,"
Yeah.
when we were washing groceries. And during COVID, we did Zoom, and to this day, we meet Friday at 3. And
Wow.
sometimes we have only 2 or 3, and sometimes we have the 7 of us.
Yeah.
But
I'll repeat it, some of it. I don't think the microphone will reach that far, or I would. Yeah, she was talking about a gathering she started in her neighborhood during COVID, and they still meet every Friday at 3 from that time. And she was also talking about National Night Out, which I had never experienced anywhere else I've ever lived until I moved here. Presumably it is national, right? Other people, just an example, and I lived in Sacramento, California for 3 years. I loved Northern California. I lived on a beautiful little cul-de-sac in a small little neighborhood for 3 years. I never knew or met one of my neighbors. Not one neighbor. I would have to try really, really, really hard not to meet my neighbors in St. Paul. It was just so easy when I moved here to meet people, and National Night Out was a really good piece of that. My whole block, well, a couple blocks, surrounding blocks, got together and had a potluck together. I'd never seen that in any neighborhood I've ever lived in South Carolina, North Carolina, Georgia, Texas, California, Massachusetts, until I got here. Our couple blocks got together and painted a gigantic mural in the intersection of one of our blocks together. It took about 12 hours over the course of a day. The people came in shifts and did different parts of it together. Yeah, those things are really important, because when something hard happens in that neighborhood, there's already a texture of community there to draw on. Another example, when I moved to Cambridge, the 7 or 8 pastors in Harvard Square started to get together for coffee or cocktails. Just had really good relationships with one another. And then when the first year of the Trump administration, deportation started happening, the attack on our Muslim neighbors, etc. The texture of the relationships that had developed there allowed us to mobilize really quickly. We started practicing sanctuary. We had a woman and her 2 children in sanctuary in our community for 4.5 years. Accompanied her all the way through getting her papers to be able to stay here. That could have happened anyway. But it happened quickly because all of our churches knew that all the pastors knew one another and had got together every week. And I talked to my church about the other pastors. And it just allowed the trust to build really quickly when we needed to pivot in the midst of crisis to do something important together. Yeah.
You would well describe the efforts that were made by church groups and ethnic groups to attract Southerners. And I can testify to those, partly because part of my family is a very large extended family where members of the family who had emigrated lobbied the people back in Norway to come on over.
Yeah.
And they managed to get about half of a very large family here.
Yeah.
But Archbishop John Ireland was famous, or notorious, depending on who you ask, about doing the same thing with most, particularly German Catholics. That's why Central Minnesota is chock full of all these Germans.
Oh, I didn't know that. Wow.
But my father was a pastor who served a parish in a town where both groups had been about equally successful. So the town was evenly divided between Lutherans or Protestants and Catholics. And the interesting thing was the big political fights in that town were over the school board, because the Catholics dreamed if they could get control of the school board, they could reduce funding enough on the public schools, they could afford to start their own parochial school. Meanwhile, of course, the Lutherans were just paranoid about this. They're going to ruin the public schools so they can start a parochial school. And in the early 50s, this was a really fierce fight.
Wow.
Well, by the late 60s, it had disappeared completely, and they were very friendly, largely as a result of the ecumenical debate.
Oh, interesting.
There are a bunch of loudmouths around these days who are like to just condemn the ecumenical as a total waste of time. But ain't so.
Yeah. I think a really poignant example of some of the immigrant history here in the cities. I was realizing this the other day, a couple Sundays ago. Me and my partner and a friend went down to Mercado Central and on Lake Street, right up the road from here, to eat. Doors were locked. You had to be let in because this meant they were getting, raided. But as I was leaving, I was recognizing that this was basically a block down the street from Ingebretsen's. And Ingebretsen's is where it is, from my understanding of the history, because that neighborhood was a Norwegian immigrant neighborhood. And Ingebretsen started 100 years ago in that context. And then a block down the street, you have the Mercado of Hispanic immigrants. And I went to the website of Ingebretsen's, and they have an incredible page on their front page about how to help immigrants in Minneapolis amid the ICE siege. And it was just such a poignant, beautiful example of the rich tapestry of immigrants in this place, that the 100-year-old Norwegian store is now educating people here about how to help the immigrants who are under attack today. Lovely. Kristen, I think I can reach you with the mic.
Okay. When you were telling the story about your neighbor Matt, who invited you to come and watch the presidential debate, and you said, "Would you like to come over to my house tonight?" It just reminded me of Jesus saying to Zacchaeus, "I'm coming to your house."
I have two rather deep questions, and you could choose one or the other. I'm accustomed to thinking about hope in the triad of faith, hope, and love. So if we pay attention to faith and love at the center of your diagram, what difference would it make to your views if you took very seriously faith and love? That's one question. And another one is, how does your view fit with Christian eschatology, which is what we all together have hope about eschatology?
Yeah. I'll take the first one rather than the second one, because the second one is a really involved response that I'd love, but I don't know that we quite have time for. But let me take the love and faith piece, because I think that's a really helpful way of seeing how some of that plays into this sort of developing, mobilizing ring here. I mean, I think about love. Of course, the greatest of these is love, not hope or faith. The love piece really coming into play a lot here and here, especially we're about to get to mourning and lament. Love, I think, in a really rich biblical sense, is always a risk. There are no guarantees. We give ourselves to one another in a very vulnerable way when we love one another. So the practice, I also think about love not just as a disposition or feeling, but as a practice, something that we do with one another. And it may begin with some sort of feeling of affection, but it is not just affection. So love, I think, has a really important part to play here. Faith, I think we have really, really misunderstood, especially in sort of Western post-Enlightenment Christianity at least, as an intellectual assent to something that we cannot prove. But faith in a biblical sense is much more an action, something that we're called into. I often, when I preach texts that deal with faith, I often use the word faithing instead of faith to get people out of their just easy, common sense way of believing that faith is just about belief, about something that we think, and instead to think about faith or faithing as something we do with our whole lives. our following of the way of Jesus, our pursuit of an anticipatory view, a vision of the future, and this gets to this eschatological question, a vision of the future that it may be precarious and uncertain, but that we have a call to move in that direction. And that, I think, is an expression of faith or faithing.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you.
You're welcome. One more, we'll move on a bit.
I'm interested in comments from you or others in this room that in light of the Trump administration and ICE being what it is, how can I be hopeful now? Or how should my hope compare to what I had 3 weeks ago?
Yeah. Well, I mean, just a simple answer for me at least is that how you are hopeful now in the midst of a place of maybe despair or realistic sort of despondency about the prospects of the future in the next few years is that you're doing this in community. You're not hopeful alone. You're practicing hope together with one another. And, I think all these pieces here are the ways that I think you move into that hope together. But one really important piece of it, and this gets to the next part of the wheel, is the part about mourning and lament. I think mourning, being able to mourn the losses that you are experiencing right now, is an important part of practicing hope. And lament, which I think of as the intermingling of grief and anger, or sadness and anger over the state of things, and expressing that, especially liturgically, is an important part of the way that we become emotionally nimble enough as a community to make the movements that we need into hopeful directions, so that we are not paralyzed by the losses or by the fear. Here's an example, and this is the picture doesn't directly relate to the example I'm going to read, but when Michael Brown, 18 years old, stood on the streets of his family's neighborhood of Ferguson, Missouri, with his hands raised in the air and was shot 6 times by Ferguson police officer. His body lay on the sweltering August street in view of all of his friends and neighbors. Brown's grandmother came upon the scene looking for her grandson who had been on his way to visit her. And in the gathering of family and friends and neighbors that grew on the street that day, this was before the 3 waves of protests that roiled the whole country that summer, something vitally important happened. Michael Brown's community stayed with his body. And you remember it laid on the street for a really long time that day. Pastoral theologian Shaniqua Walker Barnes describes this impromptu vigil that day, saying, "Quietly they watched as the coroner's office finally showed up at the scene. Then when Michael's body had been loaded onto the coroner's van, they followed, walking en masse to the police department. There too, they waited calmly for someone to come outside and explain why Michael Brown's body had been shot when, as the world had already seen, his hands had been up. Their somber poses, their insistence on staying with the body, their demands for accountability for Brown's killing," Walker Barnes says, "was an historic African-American mourning ritual. Through their actions, their closeness to Brown's body, even in death, his community responded to what Cara Holloway identifies as the central question of African-American mourning: who's got the body?" The police took their presence and their insistence on staying with his body and their calls for accountability information as a threat, and responded with militarized force and a curfew. And the national reckoning that surrounded Brown's killing by police in Ferguson was historic. But it was Brown's dead body that became the site of mourning and lament and a striving toward accountability for justice. It was his body that the crowd followed that day before the streets of Ferguson were filled with protesters from all over the country. His community followed him, as in funeral processions of old, through the streets of the city as he traveled in the coroner's van to the morgue. Brown's community stayed with his body. They insisted his body mattered, even in death. I think this story also connects back to some really poignant stories in our earlier history. For example, when Emmett Till was murdered and mutilated and thrown into the Tallahatchie River. The funeral directors insisted to his mother that they have a closed casket funeral. And she insisted that the casket be open, and photographers were allowed to take photographs of him, because she said, let the people see what they did to my boy. And I think this refusal to look away from the bodies of their dead and to have those bodies quickly taken away from their accompaniment, all of these things illustrate this sort of centrality of mourning and lament as a movement toward justice, or as a movement in more hopeful directions of an anticipatory view that maybe Till Mobley had about living in a place that would not murder young black boys like her son. And she insisted that the mourning of his body and the sight of his body be a part of that movement. There are other examples too that I think are really helpful, like this August 2019 gathering in Iceland that marked the first ever loss of an entire glacier to climate change. And the people gathered to have a funeral for the glacier. They installed this plaque. There at the bottom you see it says, it's the first glacier to lose its status as a glacier. In the next 200 years, all our glaciers are expected to follow the same path. This monument is to acknowledge that we know what is happening and what needs to be done. Only you know if we did it.
Wow.
This is an example of my church in Cambridge. In 2018, the church decided to have a public memorial to the mass shootings that were happening in our country. And a congregant built a 7-foot tall cross. And every few Sundays we would gather after church, and on these little metal tags with these little, letters, we would hammer the city and state and number dead for every mass shooting that had happened that month on these little tags and nail them to this cross. So it started with a few in the middle and gradually grew out. And there were 360 mass shootings that year. There was a sign underneath it that told what was happening with this cross. And our church was on Massachusetts Avenue in Harvard Square, so thousands of people passed by there every day. And it was an act of both mourning and protest for what was happening in our country's love of money and guns over human lives. Similarly, in the first Trump administration, this 6 children who died in immigration detention, we put their faces and names on our lawn, interspersed with the words of Jesus in the Hebrew Bible around care for immigrants and strangers, as an act of public mourning. When the Pulse nightclub shooting happened, 49 people died. It was the largest massacre of queer people in American history. All the churches in Harvard Square, because these pastors all got together every week, decided to create a traveling memorial where we had the pictures of all 49 people on a string. And each church for about a week would hang those pictures in front of their church on the fence or on the exterior wall of the church as a public memorial to these 49 people. One day I was sitting out front on the bench in front of the church and watching people engage the stuff that we had on the lawn in this memorial at the time. And one man came, and the memorial was like this, about waist high. He came and he bent down and he kissed the faces of every single person, all 49 of that memorial. We started getting calls from other churches in Cambridge that said, after your churches is displayed this memorial, will you send it to us? More churches wanted to have this memorial for a week or so that they could also publicly mourn and lament the losses. If we are not mourning and lamenting the losses that we are experiencing, I don't think we have the emotional nimbleness to do the work we have to do together to move toward these anticipatory views, to risk for futures that we can't yet see. Did you have a question?
I have a comment.
Sure.
Going back to the courage investigation.
Yeah.
That today happens to be the day that 2 young German students Shoal and his sister Sophia.
Can't hear.
Oh, I'm sorry. It's a day that several young German students were executed for their opposition to the Nazis as part of a group called the White Rose at the university in Munich. And it is something that took a long time for the mourning to happen. But there are now commemorations of the White Rose and of the Shoal siblings, street names, and institute, public plazas, etc. bear their names. And I just wanted to mention that the Shoals particularly had a devout religious upbringing, and while that eventually led to their martyrdom for political reasons, they were clearly envisioning a better Germany.
Yeah, thank you. That's a really good story. There's just one more spoke of the wheel I want to get to, and then we'll have maybe a couple minutes for questions before we need to go. But this last spoke I just call care praxis, and this is about putting our concern for the people in our wider communities that are imperiled by whatever is happening at the moment, putting that concern into practice to care for those communities in tangible ways. The way I'd like to illustrate this is with the story of the first program ever started by the Black Panthers. You may know this story, but the very first program after Huey Newton and Bobby Seale started the Panthers was in 1968. They organized the Free Breakfast for Children program. And they joined with a pastor named Earl Neal here on the side there at St. Augustine's Episcopal Church, and some women in that congregation and some neighborhood mothers, and they started feeding the children for free before they went to school every morning. I told this story to a predominantly African-American Episcopal parish in St. Paul about a year ago, and after I told the story, a couple of older black women raised their hands and they said, we just want you to know that Reverend Neal was our pastor here in St. Paul before he moved to Oakland. Wow. We knew him. Like, wow, I had no idea he had a St. Paul connection, but he was the pastor of an Episcopal church here. They started this Free Breakfast for Children program, and by the end of the year, they were feeding 20,000 children for free, who otherwise were going to school hungry, unable to learn. This became a controversy, and the National School Lunch Program Coordinator Administrator was called before the U.S. Senate and questioned, and he admitted that the Black Panthers fed more poor school children than the entire state of California did. Then J. Edgar Hoover, the head of the FBI, named the Panthers the greatest threat to the internal security of the country. And it was because of this. They were feeding the children who should have been abandoned, organized abandonment. We remember we talked about this last year, the stripping away of the resources that communities need. And the FBI began to organize against the Free Breakfast for Children program. They would spread rumors that the food was poisoned. They would forge letters to the stores that were donating food. They even started to raid the breakfast program while the children were eating. But this is a just beautiful example of a community coming together to practice care for the people who were falling through the cracks that organized abandonment was opening around them. And in the end, the state could not win the fight against the Panthers and the Free Breakfast for Children program, so the state subsumed the program. I mean, this is an example of an anticipatory view, the courage to risk the care for a community actually creating the future that they anticipated and wanted, because the government then had to start feeding children for free. And now, you know, Minnesota feeds every school child for free every day, and we owe it to the Black Panthers historically, that is true, that the government had to respond because they couldn't destroy the program. They had to subsume it and do it themselves. So I think this is a beautiful example of hopeful praxis toward a future that was uncertain and that came with a lot of risk. Yeah, did you have something to add to that?
Yeah, in 1968, when this was going on, I was a student at St. Olaf College, and I don't remember how this came about, but we had a visit to the campus by Dick Gregory, who was considered quite a wild black agitator at the time. There was some objection because he didn't being allowed on campus. Anyway, he spoke to the entire student body. From as crowded as the auditorium was, I would say there weren't many people who weren't there. Wow. And at one point, toward the end, one of the officers of the Young Republicans on campus, who should have known better, got up and challenged him. How can you possibly support the Black Panthers? They're a violent organization. They're a communist organization. On like that for a while. Dick Gregory had a 3-word response. They feed children.
Wow. Yeah. That's great. Thank you for that story. We have about 3 minutes. Are there any questions or comments that you'd like to make before we wrap up today? Yeah.
I'm really concerned about the fallout for our children. They haven't been able to go on Zoom, and so much is lost in that. I keep telling myself I should volunteer, and so if somebody wants to ask me about a month from now, I'll make a commitment. But I just think we've got to remember our children, and I know that our sexton is concerned about his children, and it's just
And she's issued an invitation to some accountability and community. If you want to ask her in a month whether she's followed through on her desire to step into some volunteer role. So ask her in a month and see if she's done that. Yeah.
So you were talking about isolation from individuals, but I mean, communities can be isolated too. So I didn't know if you had something to say about how do disparate communities come together to make a kind of big C community, or...
Response to that?
Yeah, I think if we think about now as our new justice committee, that we're focusing the voices of people who are most affected. So somehow we need to be making connections with people and believing them when they tell us what they need. And helping them to work with them to do it, rather than making assumptions about communities, making assumptions that they don't have the skills or talents to do it, but working with them to grow and support what they need.
Yeah, that's a great word. Yeah, and realizing that every community has the wisdom that you don't necessarily have, or has a perspective or point of view on the current situation that you don't have, and building your collective capacity through drawing on the richness and wisdom and gifts of each of those communities you come into relationship with in really intentional ways. Just like individuals, communities, developing relationships with communities takes a lot of work and is stressful, and sometimes you kind of come to places where you're not sure it's going to happen, but working on those communal relationships is a really important piece of this. Maybe one more, yeah.
So just a comment overall about some of how this is playing out is that we have seen, especially on Tuesdays and Thursdays when we've been doing our, packing and delivering of boxes, we've seen organizations from around the country come and have come to Mount Olive and to DHH to see how our community has put this all together. And so there was somebody from Seattle Indivisible and several other organizations within Seattle, and they had representatives from Seattle's mayor's office, and from the Seattle Times was also with this larger group. And they came to Mount Olive, and they were at DHH, and they've kind of been all over the place. But they wanted to know, they wanted to talk to everybody how we as a community put all of this together to do this work. And so, getting everybody's perspective is really important, and I think that one of the things that I said to them, I said, being from that part of Washington, I said, the one thing that I would say to you is, you might represent Seattle, but Seattle is just the city. But remember, it's the larger region, because you watch the news, you would think this only impacts South Minneapolis.
Yeah.
But I live in St. Paul, and if, go to Mankato, go to any of the communities around us, right? So it's important not to just think that, well, you're from Seattle, so think about Seattle, but think about all of the immigrant communities to support all the agriculture that happens around Seattle,
Yeah.
Whatcom County, Skagit County, and she looked at me and she was like, you're right, that's something that we're not thinking about. I said, talk to indivisible Whatcom County or indivisible Skagit County or Pierce County or whatever, because I'm sure that they'll have something that they want to say, that those are the kind of things where we get kind of tunnel vision.
Yeah, and that might be helpful. One form of partnership we might think about is like developing partnerships, like for example, at Mount Olive, developing partnership with a suburban church, and a partnership with a rural church, a partnership with a farming church, way out, far from the center of the city, and actually developing this sort of texture of relationships across a wide diversity of life in Minnesota, not necessarily for any particular purpose or end, but just for the purpose of relationship, because when there needs to be action taken, those relationships will give you the muscle memory, flexibility, nimbleness to do the thing that you need to do together, and also to know, it's not just intellectual knowledge that this is impacting a rural community. I know people in that rural community because we've developed relationships with them, something like that. Thank you for these 2 weeks. It's been really, really fun to be with you. I have one more copy of Spiritual Care First Aid if anyone would like one. It's $30, and I have another copy that I promised to someone already, I think. Oh, yes. Okay, great. So I have one copy if you would like Spiritual Care First Aid. Thanks so much, and I look forward to seeing you again sometime in the future.